Chapter 8. O'er him whose doom thy virtues grieve, aerial forms shall sit at eve, and bend the pensive head. Collins. The monk who had appeared before returned in the evening to offer consolation to Emily, and brought a kind message from the lady abbess inviting her to the convent. Emily, though she did not accept the offer, returned an answer expressive of her gratitude. The holy conversation of the friar, whose mild benevolence of manners bore some resemblance to those of St. Aubert, soothed the violence of her grief, and lifted her heart to the Being who, extending through all places and all eternity, looks on all events of this little world as on the shadows of a moment, and beholds equally and in the same instant the soul that has passed the gates of death, and that which still lingers in the body. "In the sight of God," said Emily, "my dear father now exists, as truly as he yesterday existed to me. It is to me only that he is dead. To God and to himself he yet lives." The good monk left her more tranquil than she had been since St. Aubert died, and before she retired to her little cabin for the night, she trusted herself so far as to visit the corpse. Silent and without weeping, she stood by its side. The features, placid and serene, told the nature of the last sensations that had lingered in the now deserted frame. For a moment she turned away, in horror of the stillness in which death had fixed that countenance, never till now seen otherwise than animated. Then gazed on it with a mixture of doubt and awful astonishment. Her reason could scarcely overcome an involuntary and unaccountable expectation of seeing that beloved countenance still susceptible. She continued to gaze wildly, took up the cold hand, spoke, still gazed, and then burst into a transport of grief. La Voisin, hearing her sobs, came into the room to lead her away, but she heard nothing, and only begged that he would leave her. Again alone, she indulged her tears, and when the gloom of evening obscured the chamber, and almost veiled from her eyes the object of her distress, she still hung over the body, till her spirits at length were exhausted, and she became tranquil. La Voisin again knocked at the door, and entreated that she would come to the common apartment. Before she went, she kissed the lips of St. Aubert, as she was wont to do when she bade him good night. Again she kissed them. Her heart felt as if it would break. A few tears of agony started to her eyes. She looked up to heaven, then at St. Aubert, and left the room. Retired to her lonely cabin, her melancholy thoughts still hovered round the body of her deceased parent, and when she sunk into a kind of slumber, the images of her waking mind still haunted her fancy. She thought she saw her father approaching her with a benign countenance. Then, smiling mournfully, and pointing upwards, his lips moved. But instead of words, she heard sweet music borne on the distant air, and presently saw his features glow with the mild rapture of a superior being. The strain seemed to swell louder, and she awoke. The vision was gone, but music yet came to her ear in strains such as angels might breathe. She doubted, listened, raised herself in the bed, and again listened. It was music, and not an illusion of her imagination. After a solemn, steady harmony, it paused, then rose again in mournful sweetness, and then died in a cadence that seemed to bear away the listening soul to heaven. She instantly remembered the music of the preceding night, with the strange circumstances related by La Voisin, and the affecting conversation it had led to concerning the state of departed spirits. All that St. Aubert had said on that subject now pressed upon her heart and overwhelmed it. What a change in a few hours! He who then could only conjecture was now made acquainted with truth, was himself become one of the departed. As she listened, she was chilled with superstitious awe. Her tears stopped, and she arose and went to the window. All without was obscured in shade, but Emily, turning her eyes from the massy darkness of the woods, whose waving outline appeared on the horizon, saw on the left that effulgent planet which the old man had pointed out, setting over the woods. She remembered what he had said concerning it, and the music now coming at intervals on the air, she unclosed the casement to listen to the strains that soon gradually sunk to a greater distance, and tried to discover whence they came. The obscurity prevented her from distinguishing any object on the green platform below, and the sounds became fainter and fainter till they softened into silence. She listened, but they returned no more. Soon after, she observed the planet trembling between the fringed tops of the woods, and in the next moment sink behind them. Chilled with a melancholy awe, she retired once more to her bed, and at length forgot for a while her sorrows in sleep. On the following morning she was visited by a sister of the convent, who came with kind offices and a second invitation from the lady abbess, and Emily, though she could not forsake the cottage while the remains of her father were in it, consented, however painful such a visit must be in the present state of her spirits, to pay her respects to the abbess in the evening. About an hour before sunset, La Voisin showed her the way through the woods to the convent, which stood in a small bay of the Mediterranean, crowned by a woody amphitheatre, and Emily, had she been less unhappy, would have admired the extensive sea-view that appeared from the green slope in front of the edifice, and the rich shores, hung with woods and pastures, that extended on either hand. But her thoughts were now occupied by one sad idea, and the features of nature were to her colourless and without form. The bell for vespers struck as she passed the ancient gate of the convent, and seemed the funeral note for St. Aubert. Little incidents affect a mind enervated by sorrow. Emily struggled against the sickening faintness that came over her, and was led into the presence of the abbess, who received her with an air of maternal tenderness, an air of such gentle solicitude and consideration as touched her with an instantaneous gratitude. Her eyes were filled with tears, and the words she would have spoken faltered on her lips. The abbess led her to a seat and sat down beside her, still holding her hand and regarding her in silence as Emily dried her tears and attempted to speak. "Be composed, my daughter," said the abbess in a soothing voice. "Do not speak yet. I know all you would say. Your spirits must be soothed. We are going to prayers. Will you attend our evening service? It is comfortable, my child, to look up in our afflictions to a Father who sees and pities us, and who chastens in his mercy." Emily's tears flowed again, but 1,000 sweet emotions mingled with them. The abbess suffered her to weep without interruption, and watched over her with the look of benignity that might have characterized the countenance of a guardian angel. Emily, when she became tranquil, was encouraged to speak without reserve, and to mention the motive that made her unwilling to quit the cottage, which the abbess did not oppose even by a hint, but praised the filial piety of her conduct, and added a hope that she would pass a few days at the convent before she returned to La Vallée. "You must allow yourself a little time to recover from your first shock, my daughter, before you encounter a second. I will not affect to conceal from you how much I know your heart must suffer on returning to the scene of your former happiness. Here you will have all that quiet and sympathy and religion can give to restore your spirits. But come," added she, observing the tears swell in Emily's eyes, "we will go to the chapel." Emily followed to the parlour where the nuns were assembled, to whom the abbess committed her, saying, "This is a daughter for whom I have much esteem. Be sisters to her." They passed on in a train to the chapel, where the solemn devotion with which the service was performed elevated her mind, and brought to it the comforts of faith and resignation. Twilight came on before the abbess's kindness would suffer Emily to depart, when she left the convent with a heart much lighter than she had entered it, and was reconducted by La Voisin through the woods, the pensive gloom of which was in unison with the temper of her mind, and she pursued the little wild path in musing silence, till her guide suddenly stopped, looked round, and then struck out of the path into the high grass, saying that he had mistaken the road. He now walked on quickly, and Emily, proceeding with difficulty over the obscured and uneven ground, was left at some distance, till her voice arrested him, who seemed unwilling to stop, and still hurried on. "If you are in doubt about the way," said Emily, "had we not better inquire it at the chateau yonder between the trees?" "No," replied La Voisin, "there is no occasion. When we reach that brook, ma'amselle, you see the light upon the water there, beyond the woods. When we reach that brook, we shall be at home presently. I don't know how I happened to mistake the path. I seldom come this way after sunset." "It is solitary enough," said Emily, "but you have no banditti here." "No, ma'amselle, no banditti." "What are you afraid of, then, my good friend? You are not superstitious?" "No, not superstitious, but to tell you the truth, lady, nobody likes to go near the chateau after dusk." "By whom is it inhabited," said Emily, "that it is so formidable?" "Why, ma'amselle, it is scarcely inhabited, for our lord the Marquis, and the lord of all these fine woods too, is dead. He had not once been in it for these many years, and his people who have the care of it live in a cottage close by." Emily now understood this to be the chateau which La Voisin had formerly pointed out as having belonged to the Marquis Villeroy, on the mention of which her father had appeared so much affected. "Ah, it is a desolate place now," continued La Voisin, "and such a grand fine place as I remember it." Emily inquired what had occasioned this lamentable change, but the old man was silent, and Emily, whose interest was awakened by the fear he had expressed, and above all by a recollection of her father's agitation, repeated the question, and added, "If you are neither afraid of the inhabitants, my good friend, nor are superstitious, how happens it you dread to pass near that chateau in the dark?" "Perhaps, then, I am a little superstitious, ma'amselle, and if you knew what I do, you might be so too. Strange things have happened there. Monsieur, your good father, appeared to have known the late Marchioness." "Pray inform me what did happen," said Emily with much emotion. "Alas, ma'amselle," answered La Voisin, "inquire no further. It is not for me to lay open the domestic secrets of my lord." Emily, surprised by the old man's words, and his manner of delivering them, forbore to repeat her question. A nearer interest, the remembrance of St. Aubert, occupied her thoughts, and she was led to recollect the music she heard on the preceding night, which she mentioned to La Voisin. "You are not alone, ma'amselle, in this," he replied. "I heard it too, but I have so often heard it at the same hour that I was scarcely surprised." "You doubtless believe this music to have some connection with the chateau," said Emily suddenly, "and are therefore superstitious." "It may be so, ma'amselle, but there are other circumstances belonging to that chateau which I remember, and sadly too." A heavy sigh followed, but Emily's delicacy restrained the curiosity these words revived, and she inquired no further. On reaching the cottage, all the violence of her grief returned. It seemed as if she had escaped its heavy pressure only while she was removed from the object of it. She passed immediately to the chamber where the remains of her father were laid, and yielded to all the anguish of hopeless grief. La Voisin at length persuaded her to leave the room, and she returned to her own, where, exhausted by the sufferings of the day, she soon fell into deep sleep, and awoke considerably refreshed. When the dreadful hour arrived in which the remains of St. Aubert were to be taken from her for ever, she went alone to the chamber to look upon his countenance yet once again, and La Voisin, who had waited patiently below stairs till her despair should subside, with the respect due to grief, forbore to interrupt the indulgence of it, till surprise at the length of her stay, and then apprehension, overcame his delicacy, and he went to lead her from the chamber. Having tapped gently at the door, without receiving an answer, he listened attentively, but all was still. No sigh, no sob of anguish was heard. Yet, more alarmed by this silence, he opened the door, and found Emily lying senseless across the foot of the bed, near which stood the coffin. His calls procured assistance, and she was carried to her room, where proper applications at length restored her. During her state of insensibility, La Voisin had given directions for the coffin to be closed, and he succeeded in persuading Emily to forbear revisiting the chamber. She, indeed, felt herself unequal to this, and also perceived the necessity of sparing her spirits, and collecting fortitude sufficient to bear her through the approaching scene. St. Aubert had given a particular injunction that his remains should be interred in the church of the convent of St. Clair, and in mentioning the north chancel, near the ancient tomb of the Villeroys, had pointed out the exact spot where he wished to be laid. The superior had granted this place for the interment, and thither, therefore, the sad procession now moved, which was met at the gates by the venerable priest, followed by a train of friars. Every person who heard the solemn chant of the anthem and the peal of the organ that struck up when the body entered the church, and saw also the feeble steps and the assumed tranquillity of Emily, gave her involuntary tears. She shed none, but walked, her face partly shaded by a thin black veil, between two persons who supported her, preceded by the abbess and followed by nuns, whose plaintive voices mellowed the swelling harmony of the dirge. When the procession came to the grave, the music ceased. Emily drew the veil entirely over her face, and in a momentary pause between the anthem and the rest of the service, her sobs were distinctly audible. The Holy Father began the service, and Emily again commanded her feelings till the coffin was let down, and she heard the earth rattle on its lid. Then, as she shuddered, a groan burst from her heart, and she leaned for support on the person who stood next to her. In a few moments she recovered, and when she heard those affecting and sublime words, "His body is buried in peace, and his soul returns to him that gave it," her anguish softened into tears. The abbess led her from the church into her own parlor, and there administered all the consolations that religion and gentle sympathy can give. Emily struggled against the pressure of grief, but the abbess, observing her attentively, ordered a bed to be prepared, and recommended her to retire to repose. She also kindly claimed her promise to remain a few days at the convent, and Emily, who had no wish to return to the cottage, the scene of all her sufferings, had leisure, now that no immediate care pressed upon her attention, to feel the indisposition which disabled her from immediately travelling. Meanwhile, the maternal kindness of the abbess and the gentle attentions of the nuns did all that was possible towards soothing her spirits and restoring her health, but the latter was too deeply wounded through the medium of her mind to be quickly revived. She lingered for some weeks at the convent under the influence of a slow fever, wishing to return home, yet unable to go thither, often even reluctant to leave the spot where her father's relics were deposited, and sometimes soothing herself with the consideration that if she died here, her remains would repose beside those of St. Aubert. In the meanwhile, she sent letters to Madame Charon and to the old housekeeper, informing them of the sad event that had taken place, and of her own situation. From her aunt she received an answer, abounding more in commonplace condolement than in traits of real sorrow, which assured her that a servant should be sent to conduct her to La Vallée, for that her own time was so much occupied by company that she had no leisure to undertake so long a journey. However Emily might prefer La Vallée to Toulouse, she could not be insensible of the indecorous and unkind conduct of her aunt in suffering her to return thither, where she had no longer a relation to console and protect her, a conduct which was the more culpable since St. Aubert had appointed Madame Charon the guardian of his orphan daughter. Madame Charon's servant made the attendance of the good La Voisin unnecessary, and Emily, who felt sensibly her obligations to him for all his kind attention to her late father, as well as to herself, was glad to spare him a long and what at his time of life must have been a troublesome journey. During her stay at the convent, the peace and sanctity that reigned within, the tranquil beauty of the scenery without, and the delicate attentions of the abbess and the nuns were circumstances so soothing to her mind that they almost tempted her to leave a world where she had lost her dearest friends, and devote herself to the cloister in a spot rendered sacred to her by containing the tomb of St. Aubert. The pensive enthusiasm, too, so natural to her temper, had spread a beautiful illusion over the sanctified retirement of a nun that almost hid from her view the selfishness of its security. But the touches which a melancholy fancy, slightly tinctured with superstition, gave to the monastic scene, began to fade as her spirits revived, and brought once more to her heart an image which had only transiently been banished thence. By this she was silently awakened to hope and comfort and sweet affections. Visions of happiness gleamed faintly at a distance, and though she knew them to be illusions, she could not resolve to shut them out for ever. It was the remembrance of Valancourt, of his taste, his genius, and of the countenance which glowed with both, that perhaps alone determined her to return to the world. The grandeur and sublimity of the scenes amidst which they had first met had fascinated her fancy, and had imperceptibly contributed to render Valancourt more interesting by seeming to communicate to him somewhat of their own character. The esteem, too, which St. Aubert had repeatedly expressed for him, sanctioned this kindness. But though his countenance and manner had continually expressed his admiration of her, he had not otherwise declared it, and even the hope of seeing him again was so distant that she was scarcely conscious of it, still less that it influenced her conduct on this occasion. It was several days after the arrival of Madame Charon's servant before Emily was sufficiently recovered to undertake the journey to La Vallée. On the evening preceding her departure, she went to the cottage to take leave of La Voisin and his family, and to make them a return for their kindness. The old man she found sitting on a bench at his door, between his daughter and his son-in-law, who was just returned from his daily labor, and who was playing upon a pipe that in tone resembled an oboe. A flask of wine stood beside the old man, and before him a small table of fruit and bread, round which stood several of his grandsons, fine rosy children, who were taking their supper as their mother distributed it. On the edge of the little green that spread before the cottage were cattle and a few sheep reposing under the trees. The landscape was touched with the mellow light of the evening sun, whose long slanting beams played through a vista of the woods and lighted up the distant turrets of the chateau. She paused a moment before she emerged from the shade to gaze upon the happy group before her, on the complacency and ease of healthy age depictured on the countenance of La Voisin, the maternal tenderness of Agnes as she looked upon her children, and the innocency of infantine pleasures reflected in their smiles. Emily looked again at the venerable old man and at the cottage. The memory of her father rose with full force upon her mind, and she hastily stepped forward, afraid to trust herself with a longer pause. She took an affectionate and affecting leave of La Voisin and his family. He seemed to love her as his daughter, and shed tears. Emily shed many. She avoided going into the cottage, since she knew it would revive emotions such as she could not now endure. One painful scene yet awaited her, for she determined to visit again her father's grave, and that she might not be interrupted or observed in the indulgence of her melancholy tenderness, she deferred her visit till every inhabitant of the convent, except the nun who promised to bring her the key of the church, should be retired to rest. Emily remained in her chamber till she heard the convent bell strike 12, when the nun came, as she had appointed, with the key of the private door that opened into the church, and they descended together the narrow winding staircase that led thither. The nun offered to accompany Emily to the grave, adding, "It is melancholy to go alone at this hour." But the former, thanking her for the consideration, could not consent to having any witness of her sorrow, and the sister, having unlocked the door, gave her the lamp. "You will remember, sister," said she, "that in the east aisle, which you must pass, is a newly opened grave. Hold the light to the ground, that you may not stumble over the loose earth." Emily, thanking her again, took the lamp, and, stepping into the church, Sister Mariette departed. But Emily paused a moment at the door. A sudden fear came over her, and she returned to the foot of the staircase, where, as she heard the step of the nun ascending, and while she held up the lamp, saw her black veil waving over the spiral balusters, she was tempted to call her back. While she hesitated, the veil disappeared, and in the next moment, ashamed of her fears, she returned to the church. The cold air of the aisles chilled her, and their deep silence and extent, feebly shone upon by the moonlight that streamed through a Gothic window, would at any other time have awed her into superstition. Now grief occupied all her attention. She scarcely heard the whispering echoes of her own steps, or thought of the open grave, till she found herself almost on its brink. A friar of the convent had been buried there on the preceding evening, and as she had sat alone in her chamber at twilight, she heard at a distance the monks chanting the requiem for his soul. This brought freshly to her memory the circumstances of her father's death, and as the voices, mingling with the low, querulous peal of the organ, swelled faintly, gloomy and affecting visions had arisen upon her mind. Now she remembered them, and, turning aside to avoid the broken ground, these recollections made her pass on with quicker steps to the grave of St. Aubert, when, in the moonlight that fell athwart a remote part of the aisle, she thought she saw a shadow gliding between the pillars. She stopped to listen, and not hearing any footstep, believed that her fancy had deceived her, and, no longer apprehensive of being observed, proceeded. St. Aubert was buried beneath a plain marble, bearing little more than his name, and the date of his birth and death, near the foot of the stately monument of the Villerois. Emily remained at his grave, till a chime, that called the monks to early prayers, warned her to retire. Then she wept over it a last farewell, and forced herself from the spot. After this hour of melancholy indulgence, she was refreshed by a deeper sleep than she had experienced for a long time, and, on awakening, her mind was more tranquil and resigned than it had been since St. Aubert's death. But when the moment of her departure from the convent arrived, all her grief returned. The memory of the dead and the kindness of the living attached her to the place, and for the sacred spot where her father's remains were interred, she seemed to feel all those tender affections which we conceive for home. The abbess repeated many kind assurances of regard at their parting, and pressed her to return if ever she should find her condition elsewhere unpleasant. Many of the nuns also expressed unaffected regret at her departure, and Emily left the convent with many tears, and followed by sincere wishes for her happiness. She had travelled several leagues before the scenes of the country through which she passed had power to rouse her for a moment from the deep melancholy into which she was sunk, and when they did, it was only to remind her that, on her last view of them, St. Aubert was at her side, and to call up her remembrance the remarks he had delivered on similar scenery. Thus, without any particular occurrence, passed the day in languor and dejection. She had slept that night at a town on the skirts of Languedoc, and on the following morning entered Gascony. Towards the close of this day, Emily came within view of the plains in the neighborhood of La Vallée, and the well-known objects of former times began to press upon her notice, and with them recollections that awakened all her tenderness and grief. Often, while she looked through her tears upon the wild grandeur of the Pyrenees, now varied with the rich lights and shadows of evening, she remembered that when last she saw them, her father partook with her of the pleasure they inspired. Suddenly, some scene which he had particularly pointed out to her would present itself, and the sick languor of despair would steal upon her heart. "There," she would exclaim, "there are the very cliffs, there the wood of pines, which he looked at with such delight as we passed this road together for the last time. There, too, under the crag of that mountain, is the cottage peeping from among the cedars, which he bade me remember and copy with my pencil. Oh, my father, shall I never see you more?" As she drew near the chateau, these melancholy memorials of past times multiplied. At length the chateau itself appeared, amid the glowing beauty of St. Aubert's favorite landscape. This was an object which called for fortitude, not for tears. Emily dried hers, and prepared to meet with calmness the trying moment of her return to that home where there was no longer a parent to welcome her. "Yes," said she, "let me not forget the lessons he has taught me. How often he has pointed out the necessity of resisting even virtuous sorrow. How often we have admired together the greatness of a mind that can at once suffer and reason. Oh, my father, if you are permitted to look down upon your child, it will please you to see that she remembers and endeavors to practice the precepts you have given her." A turn on the road now allowed a nearer view of the chateau, the chimneys, tipped with light, rising from behind St. Aubert's favorite oaks, whose foliage partly concealed the lower part of the building. Emily could not suppress a heavy sigh. "This, too, was his favorite hour," said she, as she gazed upon the long evening shadows stretched athwart the landscape. "How deep the repose, how lovely the scene, lovely and tranquil as in former days." Again she resisted the pressure of sorrow, till her ear caught the gay melody of the dance which she had so often listened to as she walked with St. Aubert on the margin of the Garonne, when all her fortitude forsook her, and she continued to weep till the carriage stopped at the little gate that opened upon what was now her own territory. She raised her eyes on the sudden stopping of the carriage, and saw her father's old housekeeper coming to open the gate. Manchon also came running and barking before her, and when his young mistress alighted, fawned and played round her, gasping with joy. "Dear mamselle," said Teresa, and paused, and looked as if she would have offered something of condolement to Emily, whose tears now prevented reply. The dog still fawned and ran around her, and then flew towards the carriage with a short, quick bark. "Ah, mamselle, my poor master," said Teresa, whose feelings were more awakened than her delicacy. "Manchon's gone to look for him." Emily sobbed aloud, and on looking towards the carriage, which still stood with the door open, saw the animal spring into it, and instantly leaped out, and then, with his nose on the ground, ran round the horses. "Don't cry so, mamselle," said Teresa. "It breaks my heart to see you." The dog now came running to Emily, then returned to the carriage, and then back again to her, whining and discontented. "Poor rogue," said Teresa, "thou hast lost thy master. Thou mayst well cry. But come, my dear young lady, be comforted. What shall I get to refresh you?" Emily gave her hand to the old servant, and tried to restrain her grief while she made some kind inquiries concerning her health. But she still lingered in the walk which led to the chateau, for within was no person to meet her with the kiss of affection. Her own heart no longer palpitated with impatient joy to meet again the well-known smile, and she dreaded to see objects which would recall the full remembrance of her former happiness. She moved slowly towards the door, paused, went on, and paused again. How silent, how forsaken, how forlorn did the chateau appear. Trembling to enter it, yet blaming herself for delaying what she could not avoid, she at length passed into the hall, crossed it with a hurried step, as if afraid to look around, and opened the door of that room which she was wont to call her own. The gloom of evening gave solemnity to its silent and deserted air. The chairs, the tables, every article of furniture, so familiar to her in happier times, spoke eloquently to her heart. She seated herself without immediately observing it, in a window which opened upon the garden, and where St. Aubert had often sat with her, watching the sun retire from the rich and extensive prospect that appeared beyond the groves. Having indulged her tears for some time, she became more composed, and when Teresa, after seeing the baggage deposited in her lady's room, again appeared, she had so far recovered her spirits as to be able to converse with her. "I have made up the green bed for you, mademoiselle," said Teresa, as she set the coffee upon the table. "I thought you would like it better than your own now, but I little thought this day month that you would come back alone. Well-a-day, the news almost broke my heart when it did come. Who would have believed that my poor master, when he went from home, would never return again?" Emily hid her face with her handkerchief and waved her hand. "Do taste the coffee," said Teresa. "My dear young lady, be comforted. We must all die. My dear master is a saint above." Emily took the handkerchief from her face and raised her eyes, full of tears, towards heaven. Soon after she dried them, and in a calm but tremulous voice began to inquire concerning some of her late father's pensioners. "Alas-a-day," said Teresa, as she poured out the coffee and handed it to her mistress. "All that could come have been here every day to inquire after you and my master." She then proceeded to tell that some were dead whom they had left well, and others who were ill had recovered. "And see, mademoiselle," added Teresa, "there is old Mary coming up the garden now. She has looked every day these 3 years as if she would die, yet she is alive still. She has seen the chaise at the door, and knows you are come home." The sight of this poor old woman would have been too much for Emily, and she begged Teresa would go and tell her she was too ill to see any person that night. "Tomorrow I shall be better, perhaps, but give her this token of my remembrance." Emily sat for some time given up to sorrow. Not an object on which her eye glanced but awakened some remembrance that led immediately to the subject of her grief. Her favourite plants, which St. Aubert had taught her to nurse, the little drawings that adorned the room, which his taste had instructed her to execute, the books that he had selected for her use, and which they had read together, her musical instruments, whose sounds he loved so well, and which he sometimes awakened himself, every object gave new force to sorrow. At length she roused herself from this melancholy indulgence, and, summoning all her resolution, stepped forward to go into those forlorn rooms which, though she dreaded to enter, she knew would yet more powerfully affect her if she delayed to visit them. Having passed through the greenhouse, her courage for a moment forsook her when she opened the door of the library, and perhaps the shade which evening and the foliage of the trees near the windows threw across the room heightened the solemnity of her feelings on entering that apartment where everything spoke of her father. Here was an armchair in which he used to sit. She shrunk when she observed it, for she had so often seen him seated there, and the idea of him rose so distinctly to her mind that she almost fancied she saw him before her. But she checked the illusions of a distempered imagination, though she could not subdue a certain degree of awe, which now mingled with her emotions. She walked slowly to the chair and seated herself in it. There was a reading desk before it, on which lay a book, open as it had been left by her father. It was some moments before she recovered courage enough to examine it, and when she looked at the open page, she immediately recollected that St. Aubert, on the evening before his departure from the chateau, had read to her some passages from this his favourite author. The circumstance now affected her extremely. She looked at the page, wept, and looked again. To her the book appeared sacred and invaluable, and she would not have moved it, or closed the page which she had left open, for the treasures of the Indies. Still she sat before the desk, and could not resolve to quit it, though the increasing gloom and the profound silence of the apartment revived a degree of painful awe. Her thoughts dwelt on the probable state of departed spirits, and she remembered the affecting conversation which had passed between St. Aubert and La Voisin on the night preceding his death. As she mused, she saw the door slowly open, and a rustling sound in the remote part of the room startled her. Through the dusk she thought she perceived something move. The subject she had been considering, and the present tone of her spirits, which made her imagination respond to every impression of her senses, gave her a sudden terror of something supernatural. She sat for a moment motionless, and then, her dissipated reason returning, "What should I fear," said she, "if the spirits of those we love ever return to us, it is in kindness." The silence which again reigned made her ashamed of her late fears, and she believed that her imagination had deluded her, or that she had heard one of those unaccountable noises which sometimes occur in old houses. The same sound, however, returned, and, distinguishing something moving towards her, and in the next instant pressed beside her into the chair, she shrieked. But her fleeting senses were instantly recalled on perceiving that it was Manchon who sat by her, and who now licked her hands affectionately. Perceiving her spirits unequal to the task she had assigned herself of visiting the deserted rooms of the chateau this night, when she left the library, she walked into the garden and down to the terrace that overhung the river. The sun was now set, but under the dark branches of the almond trees was seen the saffron glow of the west, spreading beyond the twilight of middle air. The bat flitted silently by, and now and then the morning note of the nightingale was heard. The circumstances of the hour brought to her recollection some lines which she had once heard St. Aubert recite on this very spot, and she had now a melancholy pleasure in repeating them. Now the bat circles on the breeze of eve, that creeps in shuddering fits along the wave, and trembles mid the woods and through the cave, whose lonely sighs the wanderer deceive. For oft when melancholy charms his mind, he thinks the spirit of the rock he hears, nor listens but with sweetly thrilling fears to the low mystic murmurs of the wind. Now the bat circles, and the twilight dew falls silent round and o'er the mountain cliff. The gleaming wave and far discovered skiff spreads the grey veil of soft harmonious hue. So falls o'er grief the dew of pity's tear, dimming her lonely visions of despair. Emily, wandering on, came to St. Aubert's favourite plane-tree, where so often, at this hour, they had sat beneath the shade together, and, with her dear mother, so often had conversed on the subject of a future state. How often, too, had her father expressed the comfort he derived from believing that they should meet in another world. Emily, overcome by these recollections, left the plane-tree, and, as she leaned pensively on the wall of the terrace, she observed a group of peasants dancing gaily on the banks of the Garonne, which spread in broad expanse below, and reflected the evening light. What a contrast they formed to the desolate, unhappy Emily! They were gay and debonair, as they were wont to be when she too was gay, when St. Aubert used to listen to their merry music with a countenance beaming pleasure and benevolence. Emily, having looked for a moment on this sprightly band, turned away, unable to bear the remembrances it excited. But where, alas, could she turn, and not meet new objects to give acuteness to grief? As she walked slowly towards the house, she was met by Teresa. "Dear Mamselle," said she, "I have been seeking you up and down this half-hour, and was afraid some accident had happened to you. How can you like to wander about so in this night air? Do come into the house. Think what my poor master would have said if he could see you. I am sure, when my dear lady died, no gentleman could take it more to heart than he did, yet you know he seldom shed a tear." "Pray, Teresa, cease," said Emily, wishing to interrupt this ill-judged but well-meaning harangue. Teresa's loquacity, however, was not to be silenced so easily. "And when you used to grieve so," she added, "he often told you how wrong it was, for that my mistress was happy, and if she was happy, I am sure he is too, for the prayers of the poor, they say, reach heaven." During this speech, Emily had walked silently into the chateau, and Teresa lighted her across the hall into the common sitting parlour, where she had laid the cloth, with one solitary knife and fork, for supper. Emily was in the room before she perceived that it was not her own apartment, but she checked the emotion which inclined her to leave it, and seated herself quietly by the little supper-table. Her father's hat hung upon the opposite wall. While she gazed at it, a faintness came over her. Teresa looked at her, and then at the object on which her eyes were settled, and went to remove it, but Emily waved her hand. "No," said she, "let it remain. I am going to my chamber." "Nay, mamselle, supper is ready." "I cannot take it," replied Emily. "I will go to my room and try to sleep. Tomorrow I shall be better." "This is poor doings," said Teresa. "Dear lady, do take some food. I have dressed a pheasant, and a fine one it is. Old Monsieur Barrot sent it this morning, for I saw him yesterday and told him you were coming, and I know nobody that seemed more concerned when he heard the sad news than he." "Did he?" said Emily in a tender voice, while she felt her poor heart warmed for a moment by a ray of sympathy. At length her spirits were entirely overcome, and she retired to her room.